Time. Good.
7 Central.
Welcome, everyone. I'll give us a couple of seconds to file in here. As usual, tell us where you're joining from. Let us know in the chat. My name's Erin Bartram. Omar couldn't be here tonight, but I'm happy to be here in his place. I'm the Associate Director for Education at the Mark Twain House Museum. Thank you very much for joining us for this virtual program for the rise and fall of the Second American Republic. Virtual programs like this are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are grateful to honor his memory with these programs. Thank you to our members. I know I'm seeing people come in. I know there are a few of you here tonight. If you're not a museum member, please consider supporting the institution by becoming a member. There are many benefits, including free or discounted admission to our author programs, free visits to the house and museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and more. Please visit our website for more information. Now on to our guests. I'm very excited to welcome Manisha Sinha, the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut. Her last book, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, won the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, among several others, and was longlisted for the National Book Award for Nonfiction. Joining us tonight as our moderator, Peniel E. Joseph, is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values, founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, and Associate Dean for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the author of award-winning books on African American history, including The Third Reconstruction. So during the event, we encourage you to have a chat with each other in the little chat box at the side. If you have a specific question that you'd like our discussants to consider at the end of the program, put that right in the Q&A section. It's a little easier to keep track of people's questions that way. That's all for now. Sit back and enjoy. Over to you, Manisha and Peniel.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Manisha, I think this is a terrific book and such a magisterial treatment of the Reconstruction period in 12 riveting chapters. I want to start with where you start, the great contest. And because we have only 40 minutes to talk, there's certain themes I'm going to focus on because you really, I think in certain ways, each and every chapter revises our understanding of Reconstruction. But to me, some of the big themes that struck out are three things. One, this idea of a second American Republic. And I'm going to ask you about that. And I want us to, my first question is going to be, why did you write this book? But one is about the Second American Republic. Two is about women and how key women are, especially to what you call grassroots reconstruction. And then really the third theme is capitalism and democracy and the way in which you make a really strong argument that what Reconstruction produces on one level is interracial democracy, but then the capitalism that we're going to see and the imperialism that we're going to see is actually not consonant with that interracial democracy, right? So which I think is very, very interesting. And connected to that conversation on democracy and capitalism and imperialism is you really give a strong argument here for a global notion of Reconstruction and the way in which there were reconstructions going on in Cuba, there were reconstructions in Brazil, and really the way in which not the failure, but the faltering of Reconstruction gives rise to a really kind of global imperialism, including annexation of Hawaii, the Philippines, but also really you connect it with what causes World War I and these global upheavals, right? And then finally you end with what I thought was really neat, the idea of the last Reconstruction Amendment being the 19th Amendment. And I completely agree with you, the 19th Amendment, which I think is a great way to end it in that sense. So I'll start though by saying, what made, there's so many books on Reconstruction. You cite Eric Foner, you cite so much of the literature. What inspired you to write this book, The Fall the rise and fall of the Second American Republic, which everyone should get. Reconstruction 1860 to 1920.
Thank you, Peniel. That is uh, a wonderful question, wonderful questions, I should say, and I will tackle each one of them as you recounted them. Firstly, I just want to thank Aaron for that introduction and thank the Mark Twain House for hosting us. I think it's only appropriate that I'm doing a program on this book at the Mark Twain House because Twain was a big critic of American imperialism. And as you pointed out, Peniel, that is one of the major themes in the book,
Yes.
how the rise of an overseas American empire coincides with the unwinding of Reconstruction in the late 19th century. So your question on why I chose to write a book on Reconstruction, because as you know, there have been many books on Reconstruction, including, the classic by Eric Foner, which was published in the 1980s. And I think I really wanted to pay attention not just to the classic Reconstruction period, which is usually from 1865 to 1877, when the last Reconstruction state governments fell in the South, the period immediately after the Civil War. I really wanted to look also in the second half of the book, as you know, I really look at this period between 1877 to 1900, when all these developments are happening, the takeoff of industrial capitalism in the North, the rise of formal Jim Crow, the last wars against Western Indian nations and the complete conquest of the West, and then the rise of an empire in the Pacific. So I wanted to connect all these developments, both national and transnational, to the unwinding of Reconstruction to fully understand what a tragedy it was that Reconstruction's interracial democracy was overthrown. And then we have the triumph of a kind of a neo-Confederate vision of race and racial subjugation, where, both the South and the West, quote, are redeemed by racism, and then that acts as a springboard to American empire. So I wrote this book because I thought Reconstruction historians had not paid enough attention
Mhm.
to this period. And those who had, like Richard White, simply subsumed it under Gilded Age politics,
Mhm.
rather than looking at the long unwinding of Reconstruction at this period. So I really wanted to make the case that the defeat of Black freedom is the defeat of American democracy on all fronts, and that it affected not just Black people in the South, though surely it did, but
Mhm.
also, immigrants, farmers, workers, women. And as you picked up so nicely, that is another major new theme, I think, in the
Mhm.
book, is to argue that Reconstruction is also women's history.
Mhm.
And not just in sort of alluding to the prominent white suffragists, which of course I do also, but also looking at the ways in which freed women and later on African American women or social feminists like Jane Addams and Lillian Wald and Florence Kelly carried forward this vision of the active role of the state, of the nation state, in protecting the rights and welfare of its citizens. That was a Reconstruction idea.
Mhm.
And the very fact that the 19th Amendment is so closely worded on the 15th Amendment,
Yeah.
which gave Black men the right to vote, I try to make this argument also because you can see the genesis of this idea of enfranchising people through constitutional amendments, and particularly women, that emerges right during the Reconstruction era. So even though the 19th Amendment is passed only in 1920, and in the shadow of the defeat of Black rights and the fall of Reconstruction, I think we should still see it as part of that kind of progressive constitutionalism that was unleashed by Reconstruction. And frankly, I wanted to end the book in a high note, not on a
Yeah.
low note. So even though the 19th Amendment had its own limitations in the sense that Black women in the South even though they tried to vote under its purview, they were still denied the right to vote well into the 20th century, till the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Certainly, colonized women did not have those rights. So I, understand the limitations of the 19th Amendment, but I still wanted to understand it in the context of Reconstruction, constitutional change. So I'm glad you brought that argument, and also the importance of women's history, to Reconstruction history.
Let's continue on that note. When you think about the role women played in what you're calling the Second American Republic, I'd love to talk about that, because one thing that struck me about the book is the duality of looking at both the way in which the interracial democracy of Reconstruction, and even when you start off with the Great Contest, and you start Reconstruction in 1860 as soon as Lincoln is elected, which is different, and it continues for another 60 years, which I completely believe. When I looked at Reconstruction, I was looking 1865 to 1898, but the arguments you make both in the beginning and the end, I'm completely fine with that 60-year timeline, because I had stretched it out as well. I want you to talk to us about the positives and the negatives, in the sense of, I think you do a great job of imbricating the story of indigenous people and indigeneity and settler colonialism. And I thought, reading your book, I thought I was really struck by the way logically it unfolds, and you really get to see why the second half of the 1880s, 1890s becomes this new attempt at genocide against Native people at the very moment. And you show Asian immigrants too, and so they're in there too. But at the very moment that the promise of Black dignity and citizenship is receding, right? But then you also saw in the first half how this great contest over rights and the role of the state, and how the state should it's a very interesting argument, how the state should treat people both collectively and individually simultaneously, which is very interesting, because in certain ways it's different from how it's usually thought of. And I agree with you too, again, that people were arguing for both collective, freed people, like you said, the neutral term freed people when you have your terminology, but they were also saying individually, because, for instance, Black women were saying, I'm this whole person and I want to be recognized by the state, not as an appendage of a husband or a man or anything. So there's a real radicality to what they're looking for, which, as you show, then influences other groups, including white working groups, who a lot of times are led astray by the racism, right? And the robber barons, the Confederate, and you even move away, Manisha, which I thought was brilliant, from the copperhead and the carpetbagger and all that, because you're like, look, this obscures more than it reveals. Because I want to show the awesome fluidity, even of Black and Native and other people's allies, who in one moment can be an ally with you, and in another moment they betray you, and then they become allies again. And you show it with who is it, Lucy Parsons, and her husband, who's a former, like you said, he's a former Confederate, who he marries this Black woman. And I mean, it's just an amazing, I can't believe people haven't done movies. I mean, your book should be a movie. I mean, it should be a mini series, really. It would be like 12 parts or multiple seasons, truthfully, because there's so much drama here. And there's famous people, but like you show, it's actually even more interesting connecting the famous people to just people we've never heard of, because their stories are so exciting.
Yeah, well, you have a historian's heart, Peniel, and so do I. And I always think history is stranger than fiction. And there are those amazing stories that one
Amazing.
uncovers and that really brings to life
Yes.
American history. And sometimes I'll see Hollywood iterations of American history, and that they invent stuff, and I'm like, but the inventions are even not that exciting.
Exactly. The
Actual
real thing.
the real history is actually far more exciting. So
Yeah.
it might be a good idea if you just stay true to the history. So just picking up on a couple of things that you mentioned, Peniel, that I think are really interesting. One, the idea that I begin this book with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and not in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation
Yeah.
or 1865, the end of the Civil War.
Yeah.
And the reason I do that is precisely because I use this framework of the Second American Republic. The first American Republic is literally overthrown with the election of Lincoln. That's the revolution, not secession, which I've argued in my first book is really a counter-revolution to that revolution. For the first time in the history of the American Republic, you have a president elected on an anti-slavery platform,
Yeah.
not an abolitionist one, but an anti-slavery one, which of course leads to secession and civil war, so radical revolutionary change. And that's why I sort of date the start of the Second American Republic with Lincoln's election in November 1860. And I do not argue that Reconstruction as a Southern phenomenon, just outlasted the so-called Compromise of 1877, which many historians are now disputing the fall of the last Southern Reconstruction governments. But I am saying that the end of Reconstruction did not happen just in 1877, that between 1877 to 1900, all these things are happening which show us the unwinding of Reconstruction. They show us how Reconstruction is undone legally. And it's not just the overthrow of those last three state governments in Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina in 1877 and the election of Rutherford B. Hayes to the presidency, that we really need to look at some of those interracial governments that arise in alliances between populists and readjusters and Black Republicans in the Upper South. You can't understand something like the Wilmington Massacre in 1898 without taking into account those governments too. These are the sort of the last expiring gasps of Reconstruction, or that formal disfranchisement and the overthrow of Reconstruction state constitutions takes place only in the 1890s, right? It takes some time for them to completely undo those gains. And that's why I think, and then of course, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, formalizing, giving the stamp of approval to the rise of Jim Crow in the South. And the Supreme Court, of course, plays a very reactionary role in undermining Reconstruction laws and amendments throughout this period, starting with Slaughterhouse in 1873, but even the civil rights cases of 1883 that declared the Civil Rights Act of 1875 that outlawed Jim Crow before it was actually established
Yeah.
unconstitutional. I mean, it sounds familiar, the reactionary role of the Supreme Court, right?
Absolutely.
Uh,
And
so,
it's
yeah,
when you that notion of the court, it reminds me of the capitalism. I want you to talk to us about,
yeah,
because you do a really, throughout the book, it's threaded where you're like, and you're making this argument that too often historians and other scholars conflate democracy and capitalism, and you're saying these are two different things, and people make this argument that you can't have one without the other, and you're saying during this 60-year period, what you see is a rise of a kind of imperial kind of capitalism that actually is antithetical to the abolition and the grassroots abolition democracy. You have a whole chapter on abolition democracy, but what you call grassroots reconstruction. And can you talk to us about that, and how, people like Ulysses S. Grant and other people in the courts, they played a big role in this kind of capitalism that really is the first kind of globally imperial capitalism with the rise of the transcontinental railroad. And you really show that those capitalists needed Black and Asian and Indian labor, and indigenous labor to make their project work, which is one of the reasons why they were compelled to defeat Reconstruction, because you couldn't have the capitalism, the exploitative, the extractive capitalism that actually built up universities, that built up banks, that did all these things without them. And as you show, it's a national and global story, because you spend a lot of time in New England and the West Coast and places outside of the South.
yeah, yeah. And that is one of the themes in the book is the fact that capitalism and democracy don't necessarily go hand in hand all the time. We are so used to in our modern world to talk about, liberal capitalist democracies
Yeah.
because that's the heritage of the Cold War era. It's our heritage of the modern world. But if you look at the 19th century and you look at the takeoff of industrial capitalism, first in Britain in the early 19th century, and then later on in the United States after the Civil War, you can see that there's a conflict. And as you say, this conflict becomes more and more prominent in the second term of Grant's presidency with the Panic of 1873. And suddenly, Northern capitalists in particular, who come very late to the anti-slavery movement, the slavery and later on imperialism is very much entangled in the history of capitalism in this country, as historians have increasingly proved. It's not that slavery was some sort of feudal pre-modern institution. It was an archaic labor system, but very much plugged into the global market. And the selling of cash crops on the global market. And that fueled industrial capitalism, certainly amongst cotton magnates, both in Britain and in New England. So I really try to draw that distinction in the book. And I look at the rise of the liberal Republicans who oppose Reconstruction. They sort of opposed Grant in the elections in 1872, and they die out as a different party. They ally with the Democrats to oppose Grant and oppose Reconstruction, but they die out as a party, but they pretty much take over the Republican Party. And their notion of laissez-faire liberalism or classical liberalism, that government should not interfere in the economy, that there should not be an activist state, which is precisely what Reconstruction was. It was an activist federal government. Their critique of that feeds into both the fall of Reconstruction in the South, but also the rise of industrial capitalism in the North. The robber barons, the railroad magnates, they don't want laws regulating workplace conditions or wages or safety conditions for railway men. As you said, a lot of these people are exploited contract labor, many of them Chinese Americans, but also coming from Latin America and also Europe. And so we can see that their interests really ally at that time with this kind of reactionary elites of the South, which is, let's not have government interfere in the economy, in society. Let's take away federal commitment from the South in terms of safeguarding freed people's rights, but also let's not have government interfere in anything else. So one of the remarkable things, I should say, about Reconstruction is that the 14th Amendment, its equal protection clause, which is there to protect the rights of freed people, gets interpreted by the Supreme Court to protect the rights of corporations. So you can see how the rise of capitalism really damages the interracial democracy and ideas of Black citizenship and equality before the law, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which is there in the language of these amendments, but they are misinterpreted for the Gilded Age era. And of course, as far as Native Americans are concerned, it's true. Native Americans, for them, the fight is for sovereignty. It's not for citizenship. It's not individual rights. It's collective sovereignty of their nations. They are being dispossessed of their land. They are there are these very brutal wars that are fought in the West to incorporate what are seen as territories, but which are really native land, into the United States. And that's how you get the transcontinental railroads, etc. Now, most Native Americanists argue that there is a kind of a greater reconstruction that begins with the Mexican War before the Civil War and continues until 1877 when natives are dispossessed. And so they see the rise of the American nation state and native dispossession going hand in hand. I kind of qualify that a little bit because if you look at something like native dispossession, I mean, that happens when the European colonists arrive. That happens with the founding of the first American Republic, right? So native dispossession, certainly in the East, is going on for a long time throughout, in fact, US history. But what you see, or what at least I saw, in terms of the conquest of the Western Indian nations is the ways in which the United States develops very definite kind of colonial relationships with these nations. The kinds of brutal warfare that takes place, very reminiscent of European imperialism in Asia and Africa. And this is precisely the time when the scramble for Africa takes place amongst European imperial powers. And they pretty much divide nearly all of Africa except Ethiopia and Liberia, which is settled by actually African Americans, Americans of African descent going into Africa. That it's happening at the same time. The height of the apogee of European imperialism and what the United States is doing in the West. And there's some really interesting stories there. Like I found out that Sherman actually went to Britain to study colonial military tactics
Yeah.
in order to supervise warfare against Native Americans. And so they knew it, they were seeing it, right? But somehow US historians tended to be pretty narrow in their view in terms of not taking into account what's happening globally. So I argue in my book that the loss of indigenous sovereignty really unfolds not with the rise of Reconstruction, as many Western historians argue, but really with the unwinding of Reconstruction. So if you look at something like the Wounded Knee Massacre or even land dispossession, that really accelerates at the turn of the century when Native Americans are completely defeated militarily, and even those programs for, quote, assimilation that are put forward are very similar to the kinds of programs that European imperialists would impose on their Asian and African colonies. And finally, to connect it to Reconstruction in the South, I really like this term American Congo that Nan Woodruff first proposed for the Deep South during the Jim Crow era, because really the people in that area were in as much of a colonial relationship to their state governments as were natives in European colonies. And I could see those patterns. And so I really wanted to link it. So yes, it's individual rights, it's collective rights of nationhood. For Native Americans who are not included in the Reconstruction laws and amendments because they're seen as sovereign nations, they're always accepted. They occupy this kind of gray area where they've lost sovereignty or are losing sovereignty, yet do not have equal rights and are under the plenary power of the United States government. And that's a negotiation of that colonial relationship that they have to constantly undo, whether it's in terms of recognitions of sovereignty, but even in terms of recognitions of basic rights, because they're seen as sort of outside the Constitution. And the same goes to colonies acquired and territories acquired by the United States. In the insular cases, the Supreme Court very clearly says that the people of the islands, that's why it's called the insular cases, do not enjoy the protections of the citizenship rights of the 14th Amendment. They kind of exclude them from those Reconstruction protections. So all these rights are being negotiated, but what's important to understand of the late 19th century is that as other people are being deprived of their rights, it is in the shadow of the fall of Reconstruction. And so, yeah.
One of the things that you discuss here, and I want to bring us back to the chapters on abolition democracy, on the Freedmen's Bureau and Black Reconstruction, is the way in which Black people were shaping this new citizenship hand in hand with racial terror, though. And you show that really at at a very granular level, local people, some who are just part of the quotidian, others who are famous, quite famous, who really, I mean, obviously you begin with the circuits and the murder of Amy Circuit in South Carolina, in Newberry, but you show throughout. I want you to discuss that the way, because I think that's still a story that people don't know. One, this idea of abolition democracy, this idea of the Freedmen's Bureau and what Black people were doing, but that, to use CLR James's phrase, that self-activity that Black people were doing, where this is not Mr. Lincoln doing it, or even the great Frederick Douglass or Ida B. Wells or Anna Julia Cooper. As you show here, these are ordinary people who are quite brilliant, very, very smart, very, very courageous, who are building schoolhouses, who are writing, and not everybody's Anna Julia Cooper and get the PhD and all that, who are just really great actors. And they give us a new civilization, but they do it under tremendous pressure. And paralleling everything they do is really the specter of death, um, which gives some haunting parallels to the present when you think about the right wing in the present saying they're going to unleash hell as soon as Trump is reelected and things like that. These people really, really face that, like it's almost like the Charlottesville, nightmare of 2017. They were facing that on a day-to-day, just like to go into town to get groceries. And there was no police forces that would help them. In fact, quite the opposite, right? And so let's talk about that in terms of, because I thought, especially those three chapters, the abolition, democracy, the Freedmen's Bureau chapter, and Black Reconstruction, really put all of that together in ways that I don't think most people know that story.
That's a great question. And that's why I have that entire section on grassroots reconstruction, because you're right. We don't think of enslaved people or freed people as having that political skill set
Yeah.
to make real their freedom. So yes, you could have the passage of all these wonderful federal civil rights laws. You could have the passage of the 14th Amendment, but we need to see how that abolition democracy was actually implemented and negotiated on the ground.
Mhm.
And the heroes and heroines of that story are ordinary Black Southerners
Yeah.
who are trying to breathe meaning into their freedom, assert those rights, and even make claims on the state, including the Freedmen's Bureau. All the literature on the Freedmen's Bureau, except perhaps Du Bois's wonderful essay on the Freedmen's Bureau, and also his ideas in Black Reconstruction, and to a certain extent, also Eric Foner's book on Reconstruction, tend to have a very negative view of the Freedmen's Bureau.
Yeah.
These people were like a social control agency virtually, and many times acting on behalf of planters, enforcing contracts, etc. And I was more interested in what freed people made of the Freedmen's Bureau
Mhm.
rather than, the agents themselves. Sometimes even the most unsympathetic agent is forced by freed people, by their constant complaints, their constant demands to address this. And you're right, the book looks at the short-lived triumph of Reconstruction. If you look at it, it's a very short period that you actually have Reconstruction democracy in the South. It's probably the only time in the history of the Southern states, from the Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement, that the South actually had a democratic government, right?
Yeah.
That represented all its peoples. And so if you look at that very short-lived.
Manisha, what one question that I have for
Yeah,
you, I know people, there's a new series called Manhunt about Lincoln's
yeah,
assassination
I saw
on
that.
Apple, and that dovetails really nicely into your book. Do you
Yeah.
think it would have been different if Lincoln had survived?
I do think so.
Okay.
Remember the first Freedmen's Bureau Act and the 13th Amendment are
Yes.
passed under the Lincoln administration.
Yeah.
We have a tendency in Reconstruction history to talk about presidential Reconstruction that includes Lincoln and Johnson, and
And
then
you don't say
congressional.
that. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
say no, what Johnson did lay outside the process of Reconstruction. His plans were really a restoration of the antebellum status quo without slavery, right? He didn't want Black people to have any rights at all. I just saw that. I think it's Tobias Menzies. So how do you pronounce his last name?
Yeah.
And
Tobias Menzies. Yeah. Mhm.
Menzies, yeah.
Yeah.
His he does have a beard, and for me, Stanton has to have a beard because I've seen so many pictures of Stanton. But I want to see it because I heard it's actually quite good.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, it is quite good. And I just think
I
about
haven't
that
yet
with
seen
Lincoln.
it. Yeah, I
Yeah.
haven't seen it. And I do think that Lincoln's assassination was a tremendous tragedy because it does give Southerners, defeated Southerners, former Confederates, fresh wind in their sails with Johnson, who not only returns lands that had been redistributed by the Freedmen's Bureau, but also pardons a whole bunch of them. You know, he just goes ahead and his plan of restoration is to get these guys right back into power, whether they were
Yeah.
unionists or secessionists, but it's the old Southern elite that is coming right back into power. And I think that was a real problem because it encourages Southerners. And you can see this immediately with the Memphis race, they call them race riots, but they were really massacres of Black
Yeah.
people and
Yeah.
their allies, Memphis, New Orleans, but also what you referred to earlier, that constant ground level terrorism,
Yeah.
racist terrorism against Black people. The founding of the KKK, of course, the first KKK in 1866, but also other racist terror groups, right? The White Liners, the White Leaguers, the
Yeah.
Knights of the Camellia, White Camellia in Louisiana, the Red Shirts,
Oh,
which
yeah.
really brought to mind to me, brown shirts and black shirts,
Yeah.
Nazis and fascists. So these guys wore red shirts. They
Mhm.
were the pioneering they pioneered racist terror. And we know that Nazis were very taken by Southern segregation laws and by the genocidal warfare against Indian nations. So we are really seeing reactionary authoritarianism. And I really wanted to show how, even in that short-lived period of Reconstruction, how Black freedom and Black claims to equal citizenship, voting often is constantly challenged and violently challenged. So even at the height of Reconstruction, I made sure that I talked about the level of violence. And it kinds of shocked some Northerners. Amos Ackerman, who is an attorney general under Grant, he's so shocked. He's like, he's from Georgia, right? Originally from New Hampshire, but later on in Georgia was a Confederate. And he's like, I'm shocked at how brutal these people are. That it makes me so pessimistic about human nature to see these people behave in that way. And he's a white guy, former Confederate from Georgia, saying this. And you have Robert Elliott saying, pray who is the barbarian here? That level of barbaric, cruel violence that Southern white elites unleashed on Black people is something, that historians have talked about. There have been books on this. Keith Williams has written a couple of books on it. There are others who've written on it.
Yes.
But I think Americans don't realize the kind of political violence and the kind of brutal, racist political violence that was part of the history of Reconstruction, and that is part of our history too.
All right, I have another question for Professor Sinha, but I'm going to open it, tell people they can start putting their questions in the chat because we're going to be getting to the questions soon. So my last question in this part, when you see this holistically, because you end the book with the nadir, and that's the term that Rayford Logan had used, and you're talking about some of the pogroms during Du Bois's time in St. Louis and different stuff. And when I was reading the book, I thought about January 6th and very contemporary things that so much of this reminded me of, including the anti-DEI legislation. I'm here in Texas, SB 17. There's just so much Florida, what's going on. What do you hope people get out of the book? Because it feels very, very contemporary, reading it.
Yes, a lot of people tell me, "Oh, you timed your book perfectly." But, I wish I was a soothsayer or I could see into the future. Because when I started working on this book nearly 10 years ago, I didn't imagine, a Trump presidency. I didn't imagine Charlottesville. I didn't imagine, people praising Confederate statues. I didn't imagine, the January 6th insurrection either. And,
Mhm.
and the response to that, I remember I was interviewed in Democracy Now! Immediately after that on January 7th, and I immediately started talking about Reconstruction and the Enforcement Acts, the Ku Klux Klan Act, while talking about the January 6th insurrection. And the response to that I saw from many political pundits and senators like, this is not who we are. And others who are saying, this is who we are. And I disagreed with both in
Yeah.
the sense that this is not who we are, means this is not what we should be. And those who are saying, in fact, this is who we are, yes, there is a history of racist violence, of reactionary authoritarianism in the United States, but we fought that. We try to fight that. And
Yeah.
that's why I call the introduction the great contest. I don't see reactionary authoritarian forces as the dominant force in United States history, nor do I see a simplistic notion of American freedom and democracy just developing on its own mythically without any problems. I
Yeah.
mean, it's always been contested, and I really wanted to capture the conflict and the different visions that people had. The freedom dreams of newly freed people, the visions of abolition democracy of radicals and abolitionists, those who are allied with freed people, and more reactionary ideas of how society should be governed, and who should have rights and who should not, and who should have access to resources and who should not. I mean, these are age-old questions, and I see that contestation over American democracy as the theme for us today. And I think that's the theme we should be talking about today. Not that history just simply repeats itself, but that we still live with the legacies of our past. And that's why history is important. And that's why the history of Reconstruction is super important.
All right, thank you. We've got a question from Nancy Dunn. Is this how we're going to do the Q&A right here? Okay, yeah. And so
That's great.
Nancy wants to talk about Johnson and during his first months as successor to Lincoln, how he used the absence of Congress and executive action to undo Reconstruction's inclusive democracy through executive actions. So just more on like Andrew Johnson. Yeah.
Yeah, so Andrew Johnson is so problematic. Yes, Congress is in recess. He starts pardoning Confederates. He makes these proclamations of amnesty, and he encourages the formation of state governments by unreconstructed white Southerners who immediately institute the Black Codes. And these Black Codes were targeting, freed people, making sure that their rights as freed people would be completely constrained and that they would be forced to labor like slaves, basically everything without actually slavery being reinstituted
Yeah.
because the 13th Amendment had been passed. So Johnson's restoration is really bad because of the Black Codes. And that's when Congress acts on Reconstruction. Even the moderates are saying, we need to do something, especially after these awful race massacres in Memphis and New Orleans. So they passed the first Federal Civil Rights Act of 1866, and they tried to renew the tenure of the Freedmen's Bureau. And Johnson vetoes both those acts. He's against the idea of individual civil rights and political rights. The Civil Rights Act actually just gives Black people a modicum of civil rights. They can sue in courts, they can give testimony against whites, which they couldn't in some northern states. Black people couldn't give testimony against whites. So giving them a modicum of national civil rights, the first federal civil rights law of 1866, it's pretty moderate. It doesn't give Black men the right to vote, but it gives them a modicum of civil rights and protections, especially to counteract the Black Codes. And then the Freedmen's Bureau Act, which Johnson vetoes. It's important to remember that when the Freedmen's Bureau is first established, Lincoln signs off on that. Just
Hmm.
there, you can see the difference between the two. The idea that the federal government has some responsibility for the welfare of freed people. And it's not just freed people, but also Southern white refugees, though it becomes preeminently identified with freed people and their needs, mainly because freed people make so many claims and demands on this bureau that is overseeing this transition from slavery to freedom. So I think Johnson's, yeah, that little what it's be seen like an interregnum, really, that period when Johnson is president becomes really problematic in encouraging Southern resistance to Reconstruction. And Congress has to step in, which they do. But of course, most Southerners are then willing to even take up arms um, against Reconstruction.
Okay, thank you. Looking for any more questions.
We had one a little further up. Did you see in the chat?
On Washington?
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah, I'm seeing that,
Oh, did Booker T. Washington and his
yeah.
emphasis on
Yeah.
industrial training and petty capitalism contribute to the ending of late Reconstruction?
So one thing that we should understand that Booker T. Washington is really operating in a terrain in the downfall of Reconstruction,
Hmm.
right? His famous Atlanta Compromise speech of 1895 is like, put your buckets down where you are. That project, that political project of Reconstruction and political and civil rights has been defeated. And
Yeah.
instead you have this, a reign of terror, of racist terror in the South. And Booker T. Washington's politics of accommodation is really geared to meeting that moment. And it's the year that Frederick Douglass dies, one of the big exponents of abolition democracy and Black rights. But we know also from Lewis Harlan's wonderful multi-volume biographies of Booker T. Washington that, or two volumes, I think there are,
Hmm.
that surreptitiously, Booker T. Washington is also fighting against lynching and other kind of racist attacks on
Hmm.
Black people. So he's a complicated figure, but he's really operating in a terrain that says, okay, that is end. So we are going to just do industrial education. That's going to be the focus. And that maybe we should concentrate on getting a modicum of economic power and have economic uplift, and then think about political and civil rights later on. Washington's politics of accommodation, though, did feed into that era of the fall of Reconstruction, the rise of capitalism and imperialism. There have been wonderful books that have been done by Angela Zimmerman and others that show that German imperialists wanted Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee trained agriculturists. They wanted to import them to, and they did, to German West Africa so that they could show people how to grow cotton and, institute that kind of plantation regime. So his accommodation to that is there. There were others like T. Thomas Fortune, who is pretty radical on many fronts, but who accommodates to American imperialism. So a lot of people, not just Black people and Black reformers, but even white reformers, labor leaders, suffragists, others, labor under the shadow of the defeat of Reconstruction. And each of them makes their own compromises with that defeat. Are they the leading edge of capitalism and imperialism? I don't think so. Those are more the elites.
Hmm.
But they all make their accommodations to a very dismal sort of playing field, not just for Black people, but also for farmers and workers and immigrants.
Okay, we have another question. Jay Miller, if we are wise, we learn from our past. At this point in our current American experience, can you make any comparisons with the American past? So I guess that's a question about like where we're at right now and
Mhm.
and the past.
Yeah, I think we need to understand that American democracy and citizenship rights and all the wonderful things we take for granted, we shouldn't take for granted because
Yeah.
there have always been in US history forces of political and economic reaction that have fought against these ideas. So even if you look at the second reconstruction of American democracy, the civil rights movement, and then now we are living in the shadow of the unwinding of many of those gains, the
Hmm.
attack on the New Deal state and its social policies, the attack on the Voting Rights Act and Shelby versus Holder, they emasculated the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we can see that this contest, the Reconstruction contest, is pretty much alive today. And maybe what we can learn from the past is not to be complacent and believe in the old Republican ideas with a small r, that a democracy is to be saved only by its virtuous and active citizens.
Okay, we have another question. It's been many years since I read The Strange Career of Jim Crow. C. Van Woodward, how does your book relate to it?
So C. Van Woodward, of course, wrote The Strange Career of Jim Crow at the height of the civil rights movement to show that racial segregation was not always there in the South, that it was created in the fall of Reconstruction, even in the origins of the New South, his masterpiece. He talks about how Southerners, white and black, are negotiating the fall of Reconstruction. He even makes a claim there that, racial segregation is invented in the North, in the antebellum North, and not in the South, which was like, okay, well, yes and no. There was a lot of fight against racial segregation in the North by African Americans and by abolitionists. And in fact, they managed to overturn some of these laws in
Mhm.
Massachusetts, in Ohio, in New York. So I think for the time for which it was written, it was good.
Yeah.
But I think we live in new circumstances, and perhaps we should be thinking about other things in terms of saving American democracy. It seems to me we don't have formal segregation, but we certainly have new attempts, or attempts that never really died down, at voter suppression. And maybe
Yeah.
we should just start implementing the 14th Amendment, that any state guilty of voter suppression will suffer a loss of representation in Congress. Now, the
Mm.
Supreme Court did not implement Section 3 of the 14th Amendment against insurrectionists, those who have sworn an oath of office um, to the US Constitution and then betrayed it by aiding and abetting insurrection. They didn't, they threw out the Trump case, but maybe they can enforce this section of the 14th Amendment. Maybe we should start decreasing the representation of those states that indulge in either overt or implicit voter suppression. And there are lots of them that continue to do that.
Yeah, I'll chime in at least with one more because we have time. Um, what do you think about the contemporary, and we started off saying this, but the contemporary talk of violence from not just the far right wing, but it's really in the air, like in social media. And what I mean by this is racist violence, sexist violence, uh, uh, homophobic violence, anti-Islamic violence, certainly at times anti-Semitic violence too, anti-Palestinian violence,
Mm.
but the racial violence and this talk, Manisha, about once Trump gets in, we're going to get an order to slaughter people, and how does that compare with what you write about here,
Yeah.
with the politics of violence that is not just once the Confederacy is dismantled as a military army, in certain ways, its numbers become bigger because sort of everyone, not just in the South, as you show, but nationally, become sort of combatants in there, willing to use arms, even in New England and in the West.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's it. And that's the tragedy of Reconstruction, right? That the North may have won the war, but the South ultimately wins the peace.
Yes.
And so you have so-called race riots that spread, the Red Scare, the Black Scare, that spreads all over the country. There's a very good book on this, new book by Cherise Burton-Steady that I recommend to everyone also. But the level of violence at the turn of the century and in the early 20th century, the rise of the new Klan, that also coincides with the rise of fascism and authoritarian regimes in Europe. And that's a real breakdown of democracy when people feel that they can use political violence
Yes.
to implement whatever idea they have. Project 2025, we are told
Hmm.
by Trump, where he could, assassinate his opponents, and the king can do no wrong, and therefore the president's above the law, above the rule of law. All those ideas are authoritarian ideas, and
Hmm.
those ideas were commonly accepted in the South with the overthrow of Reconstruction. And then you think, okay, they've come into power, so maybe the racist violence will now abate because the threat is gone. Black people are disfranchised. Um, they're reduced to debt peonage, convict leasing, labor system, systems worse than, say, slavery by another name. Historians have called all these new
Hmm.
regimes of labor oppression that Black people had to face. You think, okay, maybe then violence will abate, right? Because they have already achieved and they've won, but it didn't. In fact, it increased. If you look at the statistics for lynchings and for these race riots, they are all at this moment of triumph for many of these racist groups and racist ideas. scientific racism, social Darwinism, and all that. So all those people who think, oh, maybe if Trump comes into power, there won't be violence. He's threatening violence if he doesn't come into power. Actually, the history of authoritarianism, reactionary authoritarianism in the Jim Crow South, of fascism and Nazism in Europe, shows us when these people come into power, the violence escalates because they use the state and the powers of the state, its repressive powers, to unleash massive violence, genocidal violence, the Holocaust, etc. So I think, people keep saying, oh, everyone's being like a scaremonger and things like that. I'm like, no, if people are authoritarian in bent, they're the last people who should wield the levers of political power.
Absolutely.
And power, because they can then, misuse that for kind of mass violence that we only associate with fascism and Nazism or the authoritarian regimes today.
Well, thank you.
Putin's Russia. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, Manisha, thank you so much. I mean, I'm gonna let our host close us out, but this is the book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction 1860 to 1920. It's a brilliant new book by Manisha Sinha, who's a very eminent professor at the University of Connecticut and an awesome historian of slavery, Reconstruction, democracy, imperialism, capitalism. This is really, really important. So thank you for this. This is wonderful. It's this magisterial new reinterpretation, and it's going to stand aside all these important books, Fauner and Stephen Hahn, and just these great books on Reconstruction. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Peniel. I really enjoyed speaking with you today.
No, thank you. It's my pleasure.
And thank you both. Thank you to Manisha for talking about this. And thank you, Peniel, for asking questions that drew a lot of incredible stuff out, especially for those of us who haven't read the book. I dropped the link in the chat. You can get the book through the museum store. When you buy the book through us and not through other unnamed sources, you do support the museum's mission, including programs like this.
Get it through independent bookstores, the museums, exactly. Get it, yeah. Not through. We know what that other place.
We know what we're talking about. Excellent. So thank you both so very much. Thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. We have a great slate of programs coming up. If the topics tonight were interesting to you, look at what we have coming up in our Trouble Begins series, including a wonderful program on George Griffin, a new thing on Pudd'nhead Wilson. There's a lot of stuff coming up. Manisha should hire you all the time to stand there and promote her book. It's a great look. So thank you both. Thanks everyone who joined us, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.